All right, thank you, Tim, for that introduction. I'd like to dedicate this paper to my father, Samuel W. Segrist, who is one of my honored guests tonight. My other guest is my beautiful girlfriend, Jocelyn, who is a prospective member. My first memories of learning about history were from my dad. Instead of reading fairy tales to us at night, he would regale his children with stories of World War II. And let me tell you, Hitler was definitely scarier than the big bad wolf. So thanks, Dad. Here's to the past and the future. So, Tim read the paper, No Time Like the Present or the Past, The Effects of Presentism on Our Understanding of History and Culture. I have two epigraphs. In history, a great volume is enrolled for our instruction, drawing the materials of future wisdom from the past errors and infirmities of mankind. That was Edmund Burke. We can learn from history, but we can also deceive ourselves when we selectively take evidence from the past to justify what we have already made up our mind to do. That was Margaret Macmillan. So, one day, late in the last century, circa 1995, my 7th grade class in western Nebraska took a field trip to a one-room schoolhouse for a Little House on the Prairie style experience to see how the children who settled along the Oregon Trail learned and lived. We dressed up like prairie children, boys in overalls and boots, girls in dresses and bonnets, sat on wooden benches, did arithmetic on slate tablets with chalk in a room with no electricity, and we were generally uncomfortable. What I most remember from that day was when they taught us games and toys that Laura Ingalls Wilder and her pioneering peers would have used to make their young lives a little less tedious. Cat's Cradle, Rolling the Hoop, and Jacob's Ladder. Now, while these were mildly amusing, the main thought I had at the time was this: gee, those poor kids, they had to go through life without ever getting to play a Nintendo. Now, while that's a small and humorous example of what my 14-year-old self didn't know at the time, when I was feeling sorry for those children of invading Germanic and Scandinavian parents, kids who would never know the 8-bit electronic video games exported from Japan, such as Super Mario Brothers or Zelda or even Pong, I was evaluating the quality of those pioneer children's entertainment choices through a presentist lens. Presentist. Presentism. This adjective and its noun form are relatively new to me. I can't remember exactly when I encountered the terms, but as soon as I knew their definitions, I was curious about what they referred to. It turns out there are multiple definitions. So, if you are familiar with one definition of the term, I'd like to clarify by explaining which presentism I'm talking about. I'm not referring to the philosophical theory P equals only present things exist. For example, Abraham Lincoln, the Library of Alexandria, and my unborn great-grandchildren are not present, so they don't exist. While interesting for dorm room thought experiments, I'm sorry, Mario, but our definition of presentism is in another castle. I'm not referring to anything about Zen Buddhism or Alan Watts and other mindful meditation concepts of living in the present moment. I'm not referring to the literary theory advocated by Shakespearean scholar Claire Hansen that seeks to understand how a literary text is experienced in the present, where our experience of the present as critics, readers, spectators, students, inevitably shapes our experience of the text. Although I think Scott might be interested in that. I'll send you the link. It's called Shakespeare Reloaded. Nor am I referring to the shift of general historical interest toward the contemporary period and away from the more distant past, where 20th century history or literature courses tend to get more attention and enrollment. The kind of presentism I am referring to is the uncritical adherence to present-day attitudes, especially the tendency to view past events in terms of modern-day values and concepts. Presentism often manifests as a form of motivated reasoning to selectively seek out and cherry-pick events from history to suit present values. It can be a distorting effect, a willful misremembering, a kind of decontextualized confirmation bias, or just a myopic and ignorant judgment, viewed through an extremely limited understanding of history. There is the Latinate legal phrase nunc pro tunc, a substitution of now for then, that paints the past in a problematic way. Presentism selectively takes values from the present, positive or negative, to pass judgment on the past. When the values are positive, it tends to take the form of rosy retrospection, a kind of nostalgia. When the values are negative, a person unfairly maligns, villainizes, or condemns people. For example, it is a not uncommon occurrence for young students who are learning about the Holocaust to be dumbfounded by the ways millions of German citizens either passively allowed the Holocaust to happen or actively took part in its execution. These same students believe they'd have stood up to the prevailing winds of the times. When faced with the horrific history, I'm sure we'd all like to think, I wouldn't have gone along with the majority. I would have stood up to Hitler and the Nazis. This is presentism. We have the privilege of knowing what happened now in the 21st century, and through great and copious historical documentation, have an understanding of why and how these atrocities occurred. But to smugly and arrogantly claim that if we had been there, we would have done something different is presentist speculation. Here's another example that was prevalent enough to warrant a feature story in The Atlantic earlier this year. It turns out there are a good number of people online who believe that peasants living in the Middle Ages had it better than we do. Earlier this year, an oft-cited historical trope made the rounds again on Twitter. The tweet reads, "Medieval peasants worked only about 150 days out of the year. The church believed it was important to keep them happy with frequent mandatory holidays. You have less time than a medieval peasant." This tweet was hugely popular. It racked up 127,000 likes. And that's just the people who clicked the like button, not all the people who saw it and nodded their head. Yeah. Now, the problem is that the factoid on which this tweet is based comes from a book published in 1991 by Juliet Schor, a sociologist who has since revised that number to be closer to 300 days a year. Now, for comparison, the average American has 250 work days a year if they have weekends and federal holidays off. The writer, Mull, saw this kind of historical citation making for a very compelling device. The circumstances of modern labor can feel inflexible and alienating, and that's because, for many workers, they are. If even medieval peasants, most of whom performed forced labor as feudal serfs, worked fewer hours and got more vacation days than you do, then maybe you shouldn't settle for whatever your boss thinks you deserve. Schor, an enormously well-regarded scholar, used this idea in much the same way that progressives on social media now tend to, not to assert that medieval life overall was paradise for the lower classes, but to highlight a modern absurdity through juxtaposition with an era that people tend to think of as unambiguously miserable. Presentists will often cherry-pick decontextualized facts from history to make some point about the way we are living today. The thing about history, though, is that much of our understanding of the past isn't settled fact. I would argue that our understanding of the past is getting increasingly more contentious as battles play out in the media, politics, and school boardrooms as heated conflicts over critical race theory or which books to ban rise like the temperatures of climate change days in mid-September. So why now? Why is presentism a newism for the 21st century? The 19th and early 20th centuries were a time period of massive economic, social, political, and cultural change that sparked the formation of ideologies and philosophies to explain these changes. This time period, known as the Age of Isms, featured big ideas which are still argued about today: liberalism, romanticism, conservatism, nationalism, socialism, Marxism, etc. Within historical societies and academia, it sounds like presentism has been a concern of theirs for a while. One of the earliest rebuttals came in 2002 by Lynn Hunt, then president of the American Historical Association. In the 30-ish years since the glorious dawn of the information age and the World Wide Web, most of us are much more aware of how the internet and social media has made the proliferation and dissemination of facts, statistics, and claims about the past easily shareable. I'm not just speaking about misinformation such as tweets about the 2020 election or COVID conspiracy theories, but information about the past which is usually shared without context or deep understanding, thus making people who receive the ideas believe they understand something about the past when they don't, thus perpetuating an uncritical and ignorant worldview. One of the most heated ideological debates erupted over the New York Times Magazine's publication of the 1619 Project and its subsequent book-length version, A New Origin Story, by historian Nicole Hannah-Jones and other noted writers. Its ongoing mission is to recenter the narrative of the founding of the United States as having more to do with race and the slave trade than traditional revolutionary rebellion against the crown. For their efforts, they've been labeled presentists. However, Keisha Blaine, writing for the New Republic, contends historians often use the term presentism as a critique to cast doubt on the objectivity of scholarship from those who consider the present in their analyses of the past. Scholars who resist presentism will argue that it somehow distorts the historical narrative. For example, Gordon Wood, one leading historian of the Revolutionary era, does this when he persistently rules on its face as presentist and politically biased any interpretation that dissents from celebrating the U.S. founding as a world-changing, liberalizing transformation, or that subjects the founders' values to close criticism. What this shows is that presentism, sadly, is often deployed as a catch-all buzzword boogeyman for any challenge to established, entrenched, or traditional views of history. However, just because certain privileged actors in the field feel threatened and label perceived threats to their inherited wisdom as presentist doesn't mean the claims or arguments made by presentists are without merit. Blaine adds, historians, like anyone else, exist in the present, and our work will always reflect contemporary realities, explicitly or implicitly. Contrary to popular belief, there is no standard or neutral interpretation of the past. So, how do we know when one person's interpretation or view of history is valid and objective versus when it is unfairly biased, subjective, and presentist? My thinking is that it comes down to having done your homework, having put in the time and effort, the due diligence of research, interrogating and questioning dominant narratives, considering alternative sources, and subjecting stories of the past and evidence to close examination before making one's mind up, and not merely relying on a shallow understanding of the past and a convenient assumption that the current time is the best of all possible worlds. I'm pretty sure that's why Twitter is such a successful company, right? Like, because everyone does all those things before they tweet. So here it is on page 7, my thesis. To solve the problems of today and the future, it is essential that each person who invokes facts, stories, and examples from the past makes sure their understanding of history is not distorted by presentism. Just as traditional historians must consider that the histories they were taught might be distorted by past ideologies and agendas, writers and readers of historical and contemporary debates should consider how the speed of online discourse and the algorithmic engagement functions of social media that prioritize sensational and heated reactions are warping our sense of the past in ways we're still figuring out. Lynn Hunt argues, presentism at its worst encourages a kind of moral complacency and self-congratulation. Interpreting the past in terms of present concerns usually leads us to find ourselves morally superior. The Greeks had slavery. Even David Hume was a racist. And European women endorsed imperial ventures. Our forebears constantly fail to measure up to our present-day standards. Maybe that's a measure of progress. But this is not to say that any of those findings are irrelevant or that we should endorse an entirely relativist point of view. It is to say that we must question the stance of temporal superiority that is implicit in the Western and now probably worldwide historical discipline. What Hunt calls temporal superiority could also be called chronocentrism, which is the assumption that certain time periods, typically the present, are better, more important, or a more significant frame of reference than other time periods, either past or future. It turns out that people have been doing this for a long time. In his fascinating book, A Brief History of Tomorrow, Jonathan Margulies documents the history of futurists and other people who made prophecies and predictions. For thousands of years, people have often believed they were living in a special time, unlike any time in the past. I mean, I'm a millennial, because, like, this idea is like, yeah, we're the class of 2000. That's when the odometer rolls over and we get that 2 instead of 1. I get it. These people often develop judgmental attitudes of their predecessors or ancestors. This chronocentric attitude he deemed the arrogance of the present. I like that phrase. It sounds like a good album or song title. The arrogance of the present so often seems to dovetail with the arrogance of youth. So far, my paper is mostly focused on how presentism affects the world of historians and political matters, but it also affects the discussions and appreciation, or lack thereof, of the arts in contemporary culture. Getting back to when I was in middle school, when I was really getting into music, my tastes were pretty much what Casey Kasem and Rick Dees and the Weekly Top 40 played. Whereas my dad tried to get me to listen to Pink Floyd. Now, it's so much. You tried. I made him listen to Michael Bolton in 7th grade, which I like Michael Bolton, but I know he doesn't. Now, I didn't like Shine On You Crazy Diamond the first time I heard it. I thought it was boring and weird, but now I think it's awesome. Thanks, Dad. Now, as a public high school teacher who has taught canonical texts that were once merely known as the classics, I've seen one by one as these well-written books have been deemed inappropriate for the youth of today because of language or the depiction of women or non-white people. John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men has been challenged and effectively banned from the English 10 curriculum, at least here in Lincoln, because American characters in the Great Depression set novel use the N-word, or that one character has mental difficulties and thus is viewed as an ableist caricature, or the fact that the lone female character lacks a name and no other female character with whom to converse. Now, if we focus on this last example, Of Mice and Men does not pass the Bechdel test. But the lack of agency due to the isolation of the character of Curly's wife is the point of the book. A major theme that is explored throughout the novel is loneliness. Steinbeck seems to be critiquing labor, social, and racial conditions of the past, but teachable moments and learning activities related to these concepts are not possible when books like this are not able to be taught in classrooms. In this respect, I feel presentist attitudes have thrown out the proverbial baby with the bathwater. I'm also of the mind that past creative works, particularly ones of mass entertainment, are babies worth keeping. Those of you who know me well know I'm an enthusiastic and obsessive cinematic historian with a sizable media collection of DVDs and Blu-rays, and VHS tapes and Laserdiscs. It has been apparent that media companies have fundamentally different attitudes regarding how their old intellectual property should be framed, or if it should be made available at all. For my final example, I'm going to focus on a contrast between Disney and Warner Brothers Studios. Some of Disney's older movies streaming on Disney Plus will include brief disclaimers, not before the film plays, but in the app's description box. It's quite possible many people just click play and never read the disclaimer. The disclaimer that goes with the 1941 version of Dumbo states, "This program is presented as originally created. It may contain outdated cultural depictions." Now, Dumbo is a lovable film, which unfortunately ends with a group of crows singing about seeing an elephant fly. The scene relies on a series of racist stereotypes to get through the song, including naming the lead character Jim Crow, a mocking term used to insult black men. Many criticized Disney's disclaimer as weak, which was the disclaimer being there is better than nothing, but is essentially the bare minimum. Some saw it as a brief and dismissive act by hiding racial prejudice and depictions behind the euphemism of cultural. For contrast, here is Warner Brothers' disclaimer text that plays prominently before their Looney Tunes collections. The cartoons you are about to see are products of their time. They may depict some of the ethnic and racial prejudices that were commonplace in American society. These depictions were wrong then and are wrong today. While the following does not represent the Warner Brothers view of today's society, these cartoons are being presented as they were originally created, because to do otherwise would be the same as claiming these prejudices never existed. This unequivocal, concise, and strong disclaimer is not presentist because it acknowledges the racism of the past and doesn't want to distort the historical record by keeping the content forever locked up in a vault, as Disney has chosen to do with films and other cartoons such as Song of the South. What I think is maybe worse is editing footage to create a less problematic or sanitized version of popular entertainment. It is my fervent belief that our society needs to be able to see products of the past as a way to measure progress. To hide or edit creative works that capture societal values, even repugnant, despicable, or outdated values, this to me is one of the most malignant forms presentism can take. My purpose with this paper was to introduce and elaborate the concept of presentism so we may be aware of its existence as an ideological filter and its contested value as a historical lens. I concede that some historians who consider themselves presentists and don't consider it a pejorative are doing good, serious, scholarly work to rightfully correct incomplete, problematic, and limited historical narratives. While they object to the pejorative connotations, at this point, it seems to me like they'd be better off inventing a new term to describe their interpretive mode rather than reclaiming the term, because it'd be like trying to make racism or racist a valid professional term. One major problem with presentism is that it doesn't really offer solutions because it is very difficult to exit from modernity or our modern Western historical consciousness. But it is possible to remind ourselves of the values of maintaining a fruitful tension between present concerns and respect for the past. Both are essential ingredients in good history. The emergence of new concerns in the present invariably reveals aspects of historical experience that have been occluded or forgotten. Respect for the past, with its concomitant humility, curiosity, and even wonder, enables us to see beyond our present-day concerns, backward and forward at the same time. We are all caught up in the ripples of time, and we have no idea where they are headed. To conclude, perhaps it will serve us well to think of presentist lenses as similar to prescription glasses. If one wears the wrong prescription, issues that are far off in the distant past won't seem relevant or important, or even worse, issues which are still with us will seem far away. If we are mindful of presentist attitudes, we can be aware of them and strive to understand the lessons of the past in a more beneficial way, not with rosy retrospection or arrogant chronocentrism. We don't need to pass final judgment on people from the past to learn from them. If we are able to view history without the distorting lenses of presentism, we might very well find solutions to our present problems, and soon we may see a better future. Thank you. All right.
So when I was writing a biography of John Neihardt, I was adamant that I wasn't ever going to end a chapter saying, little did he know that something was about to happen. So that I really tried to only put in each chapter what I knew happened in whatever, 1923 or 1926 or whatever. But it was very difficult because, of course, I still, even if I didn't put it in there, I still knew it. And I wonder sort of how you're supposed to navigate that. And another thing, when I was teaching, my students would often talk about how ignorant or evil people in the past have been for the terrible things that they've done. Mm-hmm. And then I would say, what about the terrible things we're doing today? And they really couldn't name any. Like it was like, that's all behind us now, you know. And I just wonder sort of what advice you have for those situations from what you've put together here.
Well, while writing this paper, I sought the counsel of a really great history teacher at the school in the social studies department named Dave Peters, and he talked to me about the incompleteness of history, that we can maybe know what events occurred on a day, or where someone was, or what they said, or what the historical record documents that they said. But there is still so much of every day that goes by that we will never know. We then began talking about the difference between the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 9/11, and January 6th. And that with each of those tragedies, we have even more data, eyewitnesses, cell phone data pinging where people were, text messages, videos. Yet there are people who deny the reality of what was awful about those days. So I think for people who aren't aware of what evil is happening in the present moment, they perhaps need to start reading The New Yorker or something. Advice. And to your first issue about, like, it sounds like you were trying to control bias in the John Neihardt book, but yet you still knew it. And I don't know how to control that. I mean, it would be very, like I said, I'm a cinema history fan, and I own the complete filmography of Woody Allen. And it would be very hard for me to write a book extolling his virtues as a human being. To do that, but I think that that's, without it becoming morally relativistic, I think that then that's that subjective the individual's place in time is so subjective, and to recognize that, I guess. I don't know if that answered your question. I saw Stephen had a question.
Sam, that was a great subject to tackle because it's so contemporary. It's so, it's out there, and it's been one of my pet peeves for people to reach back into the past and judge them based on what we feel today.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. So can you repeat your comment for the people who are at home?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, especially the complimentary part.
Well, it was. I really enjoyed it because it is contemporary, and we've all watched this happen. Your presentation was really good and really topical, and I enjoyed it very much because it's one of my pet peeves when people do that. They reach back in the past and say, "Well, weren't they awful?" Yeah. Well, that's human nature, right? Mm-hmm. So. Science and history are both provisional, right? Because we'll do research and we'll find things that we didn't know, and science, of course, self-corrects. So it's an ongoing process, but very good. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Hello.
First, I just want to say you did a brilliant job, and your students are so lucky because not only was it incredible information, but you presented so beautifully. And I want to say, as a historian myself, I don't think there is such a thing as impartial history. I really don't. And I think one of the things that's really important is that we're open about what our perspectives are, what we bring to it, so that people know that. And I remember years ago, as somebody who really was very concerned about questions of women in history, those who are others in history, I was actually told by a colleague, well, you do polemical history and I do impartial history. And I thought, well, I'm at least clear about what my perspectives are as opposed to you. But I think one of the things that's really critical when we look at the past is kind of have a double vision about it and bring both our perspectives today and also a recognition that there are differences in what we see today and what was going on in the past. And I think in that way, perhaps we can honor the past and also honor the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think history is my second favorite subject in school. English language arts was my favorite. And I think what one of my favorite teachers in high school taught me is to be skeptical of any single narrative. If someone is presenting a history as this is exactly the way it happened, to be a little aloof and skeptical. And so I'm sorry that your colleague thought that he was impartial and neutral and you were political.
It's pretty funny now to think about.
Yeah, it is.
Is there anyone else who'd like to ask me?
Will. Yeah, Martha. Oh, Will does. Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Since you know so much, what is the main way or the main ways in which the human race has made progress in the course of history?
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if I've made so much, but I would say that as an English teacher, I have to say that the development of symbol-making systems such as writing and being able to read is, I think, a transformative event where the ideas and thoughts and stories of people from the past can be experienced.
So you're all in there for literacy.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yes.
I'm just holding the microphone.
Oh, okay.
Keith and Scott.
As you were talking, the thought of the issue of the controversy with monuments in our cities came to mind. And personally, I'm against their removal because I believe that they present an opportunity to engage in a better way than what they were originally put up for. But I think that's one physical manifestation of what you were addressing, the removal of those monuments.
As far as, am I supposed to comment on what people say? Okay, I didn't know if no, okay, no. I do think that, and one of the topics that my colleague wanted me to potentially address, but we met this morning and there wasn't time to get it into the paper, was the way that geographical space affects history. That as Jim, who was up here talking about Saratoga Springs, there's just something about maybe going to the house of a former president to meet people who have done scholarship on that, and you can't get that in Nebraska. Like you can't visit the Grant House or the Grant Cottage. And so when it comes to, at least when I think about statues, I often have to consider, personally, I don't like to see any work of art or anything that involved the talent and skill to be somehow defaced or removed. I've never been a graffiti artist. I just was like, no, that's somebody else's wall. I'm not going to spray paint a message on there. When I think about this statues, I then have to consider not the artistry or the talent that made in creating the statue, but interrogating how long has it been there, what was there before, why was it put up, who advocated for it, who paid for it, other people who live in that space, how do they feel about, I guess, the monuments. And those are all questions I think are part of interrogating the reason that something is there. I've seen all the development here in Lincoln, and I'm kind of glad that there's not any building that's going to be taller than the Capitol. I know about that law with, so I think geography and the people who inhabit that space, we always have to consider what kind of history do they want to deify or raise up, and what voices are then minimized, I guess. So that these are things, I'm not a historian, but these are things that from my research I've gathered are questions that citizens and historians alike should consider. Yes.
Oh, I've got the microphone.
Oh, yeah.
And when you were talking about Of Mice and Men and how it almost seems to be, not teachable anymore, not okay for use in the classroom. I thought of Huckleberry Finn, which certainly in a lot of ways great novel and influential and important, but a lot of situations and language that I'd rather not have to explain. You have a take on, someone who teaches literature, Huckleberry Finn? Would you ever use it, or maybe not?
I have used it many times in the last 8 years in my AP Language and Composition course, which is primarily nonfiction focused, although the AP College Board, which creates the AP exams and the SAT and the ACT, they allow for fiction in the course. My emphasis on teaching Huckleberry Finn is often on style, dialect, accent, a unit on the history of hate speech, and also as a way to consider how the different places that Huck and Jim go to along the Mississippi River enable Twain to comment on cultural values such as the feuding Hatfield and McCoys, which I think are the Shepherdsons and the Jeffersons, I can't remember the names of the feuding families. In order to teach Huckleberry Finn, there is almost a 3-day long build-up before I don't distribute copies of the book and say, okay, kids, here's the first page. Instead, I use Randall Kennedy. He's a professor at the law school at Harvard who wrote a history on the N-word, and there's a short article version and a book-length version. I have them read that so that they know the etymology and the history of the word. We watch excerpts from an episode of 30 Rock, the NBC sitcom that deals with the N-word in the workplace environment. It is a tricky book to teach. I also use it as a way to drop the veil and explain my connection to Mark Twain through family trips to Hannibal, Missouri, or the folksy kind of humor and foghorn leghorn kind of storytelling of my grandfather. But also as a way to say that this book, what the book's place in my life is for shaping and allowing for the reshaping of my consciousness related to race. Yeah, it's not easy to teach, and that is why I'm the only teacher who teaches it at my school, as far as I know. So, yes. Oh yeah, I guess you need the microphone.
Two things. You have really opened up my eyes in a wonderful way. My brother just finished his second book-length work as a professor at Penn State in music theory. He wrote a book on Charles Griffiths, who was a relatively obscure American composer in the early 20th century. And he was absolutely jumped on by two critics, one of them was especially very upset that he did not decry Griffiths's Orientalism, as he called it. He drew from a variety of musical styles, and my brother was using semiotic theory to try to understand a basic musical motif, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term. But I was just astonished by that, and then you've really given me a gift that it may be a matter of presentism, as you just talked about. Yeah. So they had him, the way the presses work, as you all know, who publish, he has to rewrite. And they could choose to send it to the same people, I guess, to see if he's done what he should or whatever. So that really upset me.
Yeah.
So he did rewrite, but I love what Disney wrote. So I'd love your comments about that. And the second thing is, I have a degree in geology, and we're presentists. Uniformitarianism is one of the key principles of geological science. The present is the key to the past. So if you see the way the beach is working, the way the sand is being transported by the waves, and you see certain kinds of rocks or outcrops, and you see kinds of ripples or whatever else, what you're seeing in the present in the way that the waves are working is also what you're then going to see in the past. That is just a bedrock principle of the whole discipline. I'm sitting there thinking, somehow, when you decry presentism, at the beginning, at least, you might want to say, apologies to geologists. This is very important for them. I can see no problem with this approach. But anyway, that's just an irony. But I love your comments on the first, because it just was upsetting to me, and my brother was a good sport in dealing with it.
Oh yeah, and I am glad that that the sciences do what they do, because it is not how my mind works. I used to be married to a pharmacist, and I'm just like, how do you know those shapes actually mean what they mean? I would say that the idea is presentism in discussions is often about modern day values and concepts being applied to the past, and so I think it's interesting to consider. You look at what the rocks are going through right now, or the sand, and I don't know I think that's the evidence, the key of what has happened there, whether a volcano erupted in the last millennium, or So, yeah, that's good to know. Thank you.
But I love your comment about that kind of, you have to change the terms. You can't use Orientalism, you have to use Asian. That was one of the guy's concerns. Anyway.
Yeah.
I was trying to find the essays that he sent me, but I couldn't find them just now, but I'll get them to you.
All right. Thank you.
I think it's important that you know that Scott wrote a paper and presented it a while ago on the firing of the cannon.
30 years ago, Monica.
30?
That was 30 years ago.
Time flies. 30.
That was when he was taking his 7th grade field trip.
Yeah. I was in a one-room schoolhouse. Little did I know that across the state there was a paper on the firing of the cannon. And not cannonballs, which I had an example about certain Second Amendment enthusiasts who are trying to believe that they have a right to own a cannon because there's nothing in the Constitution that forbids it. And some people believe that originalism as a legal idea is inherently presentist, trying to divine the intentions of the founders or the founding fathers, so, okay. Well, any other question? Oh, yeah, you got Nancy?
Yes. So I think maybe back to the point Keith was making, I've been struggling with this aspect of it too. I understand that we don't want to view everything that has happened in history from our own personal lens here in 2022. But is there a danger then of people using that argument to support things like flying the Confederate flag or, the Nazi flag or, the neo-Nazi movement? Is there a danger in saying, we shouldn't be viewing everything in the present day lens because we should be more respectful of what was happening in the past? Or is there at some point, is a decision made based on there are moral lines that we can agree that we shouldn't cross regardless of which era we're living in?
I'm reminded of my first trip to Germany, and while I was in Berlin, I found out that there was about a 6-block district that essentially is a neo-Nazi friendly apartment area where the bars are owned, the patron, and the restaurants are owned by avowed, Aryan pride neo-Nazis. The people who live in the apartments, it's basically this little and I originally thought about at the time Lincoln Public Schools was embarking on a process called cultural proficiency, and that there are culturally destructive and culturally proficient or culturally enlightenments, and it's kind of a spectrum where people are moving upon it. And I began to think about, is it morally wrong to destroy cultures that, if left unchecked, would spread tumor-like to infect our cultural discourse, our laws, of who can marry whom, who has a right to live, who has a right to be published, who has a right to be seen in advertisements and in film, and that there are so many expressions of culture. So I think the danger of presentism is that it perpetuates ignorance and not thinking deeply about the history. When I had that laundry list of how to combat presentism, those are not a lot of people are willing to do that much legwork. So I'm going to be thinking about your question tonight, and I will have the wit of the stare when, I'm walking home and I'm just wait. I should have said that. That's what I should have said to Nancy. That was a good. That was a really good question.
Yeah,
Excellent.
Yes.
Sandy?
Mine's short. So that was an outstanding paper, and 30 years ago. I would still love to hear you, Scott, but I enjoyed it very much. But I had a question, and I was thinking also the same question of Keith's, but I also had another thought about using presentism for futurism and how that compares in terms of not doing our homework in presentism to the past, perhaps, but using it to prepare for the future.
Okay, oh, that is a good question, because when I was back in 7th grade, I did not care about history nearly as much, other than World War II history, which I think is a fascinating time period. Nonfiction was my thing. I wanted escapism. I wanted fantasy novels. I wanted science fiction, action adventure, comic book superheroes. And so then when I found out that there was this movement in the past called the Futurists, I was like, ooh, I want to see what these people are about. And I think that any movement that seeks to, whether it's utopianism ideals or Afrofuturism, or we just want our future to be better than it's been the last couple of years, right? I think that the key then is to understand how past attempts at bringing about that better future, how those events failed, and to learn from history to try to avoid those mistakes. So that's how I would think about presentism and the future.
Hello, Sam.
Oh, hey.
Hey. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Were there any last minute purges to your paper that you're like, wow, I really wish I could have fit that in, but maybe you cut because of time?
I had one about the idea of it's so easy it was a more celebrity media example of how over the years it's really easy to view a certain celebrity as a punching bag, to make jokes about them. And the example I was going to use was, for the last 10, 15 years, Bruce Willis's career has sucked. Like, people looking like he's just doing glorified cameos in these straight-to-DVD streaming movies. And he gets $1 million paycheck. He's only there for 2 minutes. And over time, people are saying, like, yeah, he's just phoning it in. Like, what a hack, what a fallen Hollywood god. And then this last spring, it comes out. It turns out he's got linguistic aphasia. He had to have the words in an earpiece, his lines fed into him when he was on set. He would blank out mid-sentence and kind of forget where he was and not be able to express things. And when I think about history, I'm very much about, let's be skeptical of single narratives and also defer judgment, knowing that there may be some aspect of a story we don't know about. And when that news comes out and becomes part of the story of Bruce Willis's career, then I think it makes us go like, oh, I guess I really wish I hadn't made all those tweets about how much Bruce Willis was a hack now. And not that I ever did that. I love Bruce. Die Hard, great Christmas movie. So, yeah, good question. Thank you, everyone.
That's terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sam. That's it for tonight.
Who's up next time?
I believe Will is up next time. Will? We'll be back here in a month. This was my fault. We did everything at the last minute this time. They want us to move a little faster next time, so I'll be sending out the menu choices maybe a week earlier than I did this time, so we can, although everything turned out fine, I hope everybody enjoyed their meal. Good to see everybody. We'll see you in a month.
Thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you.